Welcome to the Deep Sleep Library, a place where lost worlds, forgotten civilizations, and ancient mysteries drift gently into your mind. Tonight, we drift back to an age of thunder and silence, a time when the world stood on the edge of chaos, and then slowly learned how to find peace again. This is the story of World War II, not told in the roar of battle, but in the hush that follows it. A tale of nations and nightmares, of courage, cruelty, and the long road back to calm. If you enjoy these stories, you can support the library by liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts or favorite part, and subscribing so you never miss another journey into history. And don't forget to check out our other videos. There are many more lost worlds and hidden tales waiting to carry you into calm, immersive adventures. So, make yourself comfortable, relax, and let your mind drift as we begin tonight's journey into the past. Chapter 1: Aftermath of World War I Seeds of Conflict. The year was 1919. The guns of the Great War had finally fallen silent. After 4 long, exhausting years of fighting, Europe lay bruised, scarred, and uncertain. Cities were in ruins, economies had collapsed, and millions of families were left grieving those who would never return. The world had been promised that the Great War, what we now call World War I, would be the war to end all wars. But, as we often learn, history has a way of repeating itself. And sometimes, it repeats itself rather loudly. The victors of the war gathered in the grand halls of Versailles, just outside Paris, to decide how to rebuild the world. The result was the Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, a document meant to secure peace, but one that instead planted the very seeds of future conflict. The treaty was harsh on Germany. The country was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, something known as the War Guilt Clause. It also had to pay enormous reparations, lose significant territory, and drastically reduce its military. On paper, it sounded like justice. In reality, it felt like humiliation. Germany's economy collapsed, its people starved, and its pride, once immense, crumbled into resentment. And resentment, as history so often shows, is a dangerous seed to plant. As the 1920s dawned, Europe tried to recover. People wanted peace and normalcy, and perhaps a little jazz. But beneath the surface, tensions brewed quietly. In Italy, a charismatic figure named Benito Mussolini promised to restore national glory through something called fascism, a new, aggressive form of politics that prized strength and nationalism above all else. In Germany, the young democracy of the Weimar Republic struggled to survive. Inflation skyrocketed to absurd levels. People carried wheelbarrows of money just to buy a loaf of bread. At one point, children used worthless banknotes as building blocks. Meanwhile, across the world, Japan watched carefully. Its growing empire in Asia was hungry for resources, and its leaders believed expansion was essential. A sense of militaristic pride began to take hold there, too. The world was still recovering when the Great Depression hit in 1929. It was the single worst economic collapse in modern history. Banks failed, industries fell silent, and millions were left unemployed and hungry. Democracy, so full of promise after the war, suddenly seemed fragile. In times of desperation, people often turn to those who offer simple answers. And one such man was beginning to rise in Germany, Adolf Hitler. At first, he was just another angry politician shouting in beer halls, blaming the Treaty of Versailles for all of Germany's problems. But as the depression deepened, his words began to resonate. He promised jobs, pride, and revenge. He promised to make Germany great again, and desperate people listened. By 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, and the world began to change in ways few could have imagined. But let's step back for a moment. The world between the two wars was not only a time of political upheaval. It was also a strange, beautiful, and contradictory era. In Paris, writers like Hemingway and Fitzgerald drank coffee and wrote about the lost generation. In America, jazz filled the air and the roaring 20s danced on. New inventions, the radio, the automobile, the airplane, made the world feel smaller, faster, and more connected than ever. And yet, as the world moved forward, the shadow of the Great War lingered quietly behind it. The League of Nations, created to ensure world peace, was noble in theory, but weak in practice. It had no real power, no army, and no ability to enforce its rules. When smaller conflicts broke out, like Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931, the League mostly just sent letters of disapproval. Unfortunately, dictators tend not to be swayed by strongly worded letters. In Italy, Mussolini's fascist experiment was in full swing. He wore uniforms, made grand speeches, and promised to rebuild the Roman Empire. He even managed to make trains run on time, though history suggests that claim might be slightly exaggerated. In Germany, Hitler's Nazi Party gained strength. He was a master of propaganda, using radio and rallies to stir national emotion. Flags, symbols, marches. They all became part of a carefully orchestrated spectacle designed to unify the nation under his control. By the mid-1930s, Germany was secretly rebuilding its army, violating the Treaty of Versailles. The world noticed, but looked away. Britain and France, still haunted by the horrors of the last war, practiced something called appeasement, the hope that if they just gave Hitler what he wanted, he might stop wanting more. He did not. In Spain, a brutal civil war erupted in 1936, a preview of the global conflict to come. Hitler and Mussolini supported the fascist side, testing new weapons and tactics that would later devastate Europe. Meanwhile, democratic nations mostly stayed out of it. By the late 1930s, the map of Europe was starting to shift again. Germany reoccupied the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and then set its eyes on Czechoslovakia, claiming it needed to protect the German-speaking population there. At the Munich Conference in 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain met with Hitler and agreed to let him take part of Czechoslovakia in exchange for peace. Chamberlain returned home waving a piece of paper, declaring he had secured peace for our time. It was tragically a short-lived peace. As 1939 approached, Europe stood at a crossroads. The memories of the last war still haunted everyone. Yet the drums of a new conflict began to echo faintly in the distance. Germany, now a powerful and frighteningly efficient machine, set its eyes on Poland. The world watched, hoping it was all just political posturing, that no one would be reckless enough to start another world war. But in the early hours of September 1st, 1939, German tanks rolled across the Polish border. Within days, Britain and France declared war. And just like that, the world once again descended into darkness. The peace that had been so carefully, and perhaps naively, built after the Great War was gone. The seeds of resentment, humiliation, and fear had finally sprouted into the flames of World War II. As night falls on this chapter of history, imagine the quiet before the storm. Chapter 2, Rise of the Dictators. The 1930s, a decade of promise for some, despair for many. The world was still trying to recover from the Great Depression, yet the wounds of the First World War hadn't truly healed. People wanted stability, direction, and above all, hope. But sometimes the figures who promise the most hope are the ones who bring the greatest ruin. As the dust of the 1920s settled, new leaders began to rise. Men who thrived on chaos, who fed on fear, and who spoke with the certainty people were desperate to hear. They were the dictators, and their voices would soon echo across continents. In Italy, Benito Mussolini stood proudly before cheering crowds, dressed in sharp uniforms and dramatic poses that seemed pulled straight from a Roman statue. He had founded the Fascist Party, a movement that believed in absolute authority, nationalism, and the idea that the nation was more important than the individual. It was, to many Italians, a promise of strength in uncertain times. To others, it was a theatrical display of arrogance. But Mussolini's confidence was infectious. He often called himself Il Duce, meaning the leader. Under his regime, dissent was crushed, the press was silenced, and propaganda filled every corner of daily life. Still, trains really did run on time, or at least people were too afraid to say they didn't. Meanwhile, in Germany, another man had risen from obscurity. Adolf Hitler. By the early 1930s, he had transformed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, from a fringe movement into a national force. His message was simple and chilling. Germany's suffering was not its own fault. The Treaty of Versailles had betrayed them, and the nation's enemies, both external and internal, had to be purged for Germany to rise again. Hitler was a master orator. He didn't just speak, he performed. His speeches built slowly, like a storm, until the crowd was swept away in roaring applause. He promised jobs, unity, and a glorious future, and many wanted to believe him. When Hitler became chancellor in 1933, he wasted no time dismantling democracy from within. The Reichstag fire that same year gave him the excuse to pass emergency laws, silencing political opponents and giving himself nearly unlimited power. Within months, he became Führer, both head of state and government. He outlawed all other political parties, censored the press, and turned Germany into a single, controlled voice, his own. Books that didn't align with Nazi ideology were burned. Education was reshaped to glorify obedience and national pride. And across the country, fear quietly became the new normal. The Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, ensured that no one spoke out. People learned to whisper carefully, even in their own homes. Children were taught to idolize the Führer and to report anyone who spoke ill of him, even family members. Yet, to many, life seemed to improve, at least on the surface. Unemployment dropped. Highways were built. The economy revived. But behind this apparent recovery lay something darker. A nation preparing for war. Factories produced not only cars and radios, but tanks and aircraft. And while the world watched nervously, Germany's military, forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles, grew stronger each year. Across the sea, another empire was also awakening. Japan. In the 1930s, Japan's leaders, influenced by militarism and nationalism, believed their country was destined to dominate Asia. Their economy depended heavily on imports, oil, steel, rubber. And as the global depression deepened, Japan turned its eyes outward, toward expansion. In 1931, Japanese forces invaded Manchuria, claiming they were protecting their interests. The world protested. The League of Nations condemned it. Japan responded by simply leaving the League. And that was that. It was a sign to the world aggression could go unpunished. And others, watching closely, took note. Back in Europe, Hitler admired Japan's defiance. He saw in them a kindred spirit, nations hungry for power, willing to reshape the world. And so, The idea of an alliance between Germany, Italy, and Japan began to take shape, the future Axis powers. But first, Hitler had work to do at home. His next step was to rebuild Germany's army in full view of the world. He withdrew from international disarmament talks and began openly violating the Treaty of Versailles. Tanks rolled through parade grounds. Airplanes filled the skies again. And while Britain and France frowned and muttered, they did nothing. In 1935, Mussolini launched a bold, if brutal, campaign to prove Italy's strength by invading Ethiopia. It was a colonial war that shocked many, but once again the League of Nations proved powerless. Economic sanctions were mild, enforcement was non-existent. Mussolini laughed off the criticism, basking in the glow of conquest. He and Hitler soon realized they made an excellent pair, both driven by ambition, ego, and a flair for grand theatrics. They admired each other's ruthlessness, though not necessarily each other's fashion sense. By 1936, Hitler sent German troops into the Rhineland, a region that had been demilitarized after World War I. It was a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. German generals feared that if France responded, they'd have to retreat. But France didn't respond, and Hitler learned a crucial lesson. The world's democracies were not ready for another war. That same year, the Spanish Civil War erupted, a violent struggle between fascists and republicans. Hitler and Mussolini saw an opportunity. They sent weapons, planes, and volunteer soldiers to support the fascist side led by Francisco Franco. It was, in effect, a testing ground, a place to practice tactics and weapons that would later devastate Europe. The bombing of Guernica, immortalized by Pablo Picasso's haunting painting, showed the world the new face of war: modern, mechanized, and merciless. As the 1930s progressed, the dictators grew bolder. In Germany, anti-Semitic laws stripped Jewish citizens of their rights and dignity. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 defined who was considered Jewish and banned them from many professions. In 1938, during Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, Jewish homes, synagogues, and businesses were attacked. Windows shattered, fires burned, and the message was clear. In Hitler's Germany, there was no room for tolerance. The world watched with horror and hesitation. Leaders condemned the violence, but took no real action. It was easier, it seemed, to hope the storm would pass on its own. By 1938, Hitler had set his sights on uniting all German-speaking peoples. He began with Austria, orchestrating an event known as the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria into the German Reich. German troops marched in without resistance, greeted by cheering crowds. For many Austrians, this was reunification. For others, it was occupation. Next came Czechoslovakia, particularly the Sudetenland, a region with many ethnic Germans. At the Munich conference, Hitler promised this was his final demand. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed him and returned home declaring, "Peace for our time." But peace, as it turned out, was not on the menu. By 1939, the map of Europe looked unsettlingly familiar. Borders shifting, armies growing, alliances forming. Germany had rearmed, Italy had conquered, Japan was expanding across Asia. Three dictators stood at the height of their power, each convinced of their destiny to rule. They promised glory, empire, and unity, but what they truly brought was fear, destruction, and loss. The stage was set. The world held its breath. And soon, the spark that would ignite World War II was about to be struck. Chapter 3: War Begins. It was the dawn of September 1st, 1939. Across Europe, people woke to headlines they hoped they'd never see again. Germany had invaded Poland. In the gray mist of early morning, tanks rolled across the border, their engines humming like a mechanical storm. Planes filled the skies. Explosions echoed across the Polish countryside. And once again, the world was at war. The German military called it Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. It was a new kind of warfare, fast, coordinated, overwhelming. Instead of the slow, muddy trench battles of World War I, this was movement and speed. Armored divisions, tanks, and aircraft worked together like a well-rehearsed orchestra, though one playing a very loud and violent symphony. The Polish forces fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. Within weeks, the country was overwhelmed. And to make matters worse, on September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, sealing Poland's fate. By the end of the month, Poland had been divided between Hitler and Stalin, two men who, despite their opposite ideologies, had made a secret pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, promising not to attack each other and to share the spoils of Eastern Europe. It was a cynical agreement, one that shocked the world. But for now, it suited both men perfectly. 2 days after the invasion began, on September 3, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The radio crackled to life across Britain as Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain spoke in somber tones. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note, stating that unless we heard from them, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently, this country is at war with Germany. The words hung heavy in the air. After just 20 years of peace, Europe was once again marching to war. Yet, oddly enough, for several months, very little happened on the Western Front. Historians later called it the phony war, or in German, the Sitzkrieg, the sitting war. Soldiers built defenses, civilians prepared shelters, and everyone waited. There was an eerie stillness, a sense of déjà vu. People hoped, perhaps, that it would all stop as suddenly as it had begun. But beneath that fragile quiet, the storm was gathering strength. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union turned its attention northward. In late 1939, Stalin's army invaded Finland, beginning what became known as the Winter War. It was a brutal, freezing conflict fought in deep snow and bitter cold. The Finnish army, though vastly outnumbered, resisted fiercely, using skis, camouflage, and cunning tactics. They fought so effectively that the Soviets, despite their numbers, suffered heavy losses. Eventually, Finland was forced to concede territory, but their resistance became legendary. The world watched in awe as a small, determined nation held back a giant, at least for a while. Back in the West, Hitler prepared for the next phase of his plan, the conquest of Western Europe. In the spring of 1940, German forces moved once again, this time through Denmark and Norway. Both fell quickly. The attack on Norway was particularly significant, as it secured important access to iron or shipments from Sweden, vital for Germany's war machine. Britain tried to intervene, but it was too late. A young officer named Winston Churchill, serving as First Lord of the Admiralty, pushed for a more aggressive response. And soon his time would come. In May 1940, Hitler unleashed his army on France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. This time, the Blitzkrieg was in full force. Tanks tore through the Ardennes forest, a region thought impassable, catching the French completely off guard. The Maginot Line, France's heavily fortified border, was bypassed entirely. Within weeks, the German army swept across Western Europe like a storm. City after city fell. Refugees crowded the roads. The once proud French army crumbled under the relentless advance. By June 14, 1940, Paris was occupied. Photographs from that day show German soldiers posing before the Eiffel Tower, confident, triumphant, and chillingly composed. For France, it was a national tragedy. For Hitler, it was vindication. On June 22, 1940, France officially surrendered. The northern part of the country fell under direct German control, while the south became the Vichy regime, a puppet government that cooperated with the Nazis. Across the English Channel, Britain now stood alone. Its army, trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, faced annihilation. But in one of the most remarkable rescues in history, an improvised fleet of civilian boats, ferries, and fishing vessels, nearly 800 in total, sailed across the channel to bring the soldiers home. This extraordinary effort, known as the Miracle of Dunkirk, saved over 300,000 troops. It was a narrow escape and a vital one. With France defeated, Hitler expected Britain to negotiate peace. But Britain had other plans. In May 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, replacing Chamberlain. Churchill's gravelly voice, his unyielding determination, and his famously defiant speeches inspired a nation that refused to surrender. He told Parliament, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender." The words stirred courage across Britain, though, admittedly, they didn't make people sleep any easier at night. By the summer of 1940, Hitler prepared to invade Britain. But first, he needed control of the skies. This led to the Battle of Britain, the first major campaign fought entirely by air forces. The German Luftwaffe launched daily bombing raids over British cities and airfields. Their goal: destroy the Royal Air Force and pave the way for invasion. But the RAF fought back fiercely, with a combination of radar technology, skilled pilots, and sheer determination. Young men from across the Commonwealth and occupied Europe joined the fight, Polish, Czech, Canadian, and New Zealand pilots among them. For months, dogfights raged in the skies. The roar of engines and the distant drone of bombers became the soundtrack of everyday life. As the air war intensified, so did the bombing of cities. London and other urban centers endured nightly raids, the Blitz. Families huddled in shelters, listening to the sirens wail and the faint, dreadful hum of approaching aircraft. Even in those dark nights, people found resilience. Cafes reopened the morning after bombings. Trains still ran. Children played in rubble-strewn streets. Londoners developed a quiet motto: keep calm and carry on. And carry on they did. By October 1940, the Luftwaffe had failed to break British resistance. The invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, was postponed indefinitely. It was Hitler's first real setback. As the year drew to a close, Europe was a map of uncertainty. From the Atlantic coast to the Russian border, Nazi banners flew. Britain stood defiant, alone but unbroken. The war had begun with fire and fury, and yet this was only the beginning. The world was changing faster than anyone could imagine. The storm that had begun in Poland was spreading, reaching across continents. And soon it would become truly global. But for now, the night grows quiet. The Blitz fades into silence, and the world holds its breath, unaware that even darker days lie ahead. Chapter 4: The Battle of Britain and the Blitz. The summer of 1940 hung heavy over Europe, warm, tense, and uncertain. Across the English Channel, Hitler watched Britain with calculating eyes. France had fallen. The continent was his. Only this stubborn island remained, a defiant patch of green refusing to bow. For Britain, the question was simple but terrifying. Could they survive what was coming next? The invasion plan was called Operation Sea Lion. But before German troops could cross the channel, Hitler needed control of the skies. Without that, any invasion would be suicide. And so began one of the most famous aerial battles in history, the Battle of Britain. It wasn't fought with grand armies or mighty fleets. It was fought in the open air, between a few hundred men in fragile, roaring machines of metal and glass. They soared, dove, and fought among the clouds, often never seeing the ground until they returned, if they returned at all. The German Luftwaffe, commanded by Hermann Göring, launched massive bombing raids in July 1940. Their goal was simple: destroy the Royal Air Force airfield by airfield, plane by plane. But Britain had an advantage, one invisible yet vital: radar. Along the coast, tall, skeletal towers scanned the skies, detecting incoming aircraft long before they could be seen. It was the first real use of electronic warfare, and it gave the RAF time to prepare. Another advantage lay in the hands of a few brilliant engineers, the creators of the Spitfire and the Hurricane, sleek fighter planes that became legends. They were fast, agile, and, in the right hands, deadly. Every day, the skies above Britain became a stage of swirling white contrails and thunderous engine roars. Civilians watched from fields and rooftops, seeing their defenders fight high above. Tiny specks glinting in sunlight, dancing between life and death. Radio broadcasts kept the nation informed. Newspapers printed lists of fallen pilots, while Churchill's deep voice resonated across the airwaves. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The few, as they came to be known, became national heroes, though most were just boys barely out of their teens. By late August, the Luftwaffe changed tactics. Instead of attacking military targets, they began bombing cities, especially London. Perhaps Hitler thought that breaking civilian morale would force Britain to surrender. Instead, he ignited something unbreakable. On the night of September 7, 1940, the first wave of heavy bombing struck London. Fires blazed along the docks, warehouses, and homes. Smoke rose into the dark sky like ghostly pillars. The Blitz, short for Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had begun, and for the next 57 consecutive nights the bombs fell. Every evening the sound began the same way: the wail of air raid sirens, the hurried footsteps of families heading to shelters, and then the low hum of approaching bombers. People huddled together underground, clutching blankets, listening to the rumble above. In the tunnels of the London Underground, thousands slept shoulder to shoulder, strangers united by fear and fatigue. Mothers soothed crying children. Men told stories to keep spirits high. Someone might start to hum softly, and a whole station would quietly join in. It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was community, and in wartime that was everything. Above ground, the destruction was immense. Entire streets vanished overnight. Churches, schools, markets, all reduced to rubble. Yet, come morning, Londoners emerged from their shelters, brushed off the dust, and went about their day. They called it the Blitz spirit, a mixture of defiance, humor, and quiet endurance. Milkmen still delivered milk, even through bombed-out neighborhoods. Bus drivers navigated cratered streets. And the local pubs, those indestructible bastions of British sanity, somehow always reopened. As one Londoner reportedly said, "If we're going to die, we might as well do it with a pint in hand." Meanwhile, British industry worked around the clock. Damaged aircraft were repaired, Factories churned out new ones, and young pilots arrived daily to take the places of those lost. Among them were volunteers from across the world, Polish, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand airmen, all fighting under the same cause. Each night, searchlights swept the sky like ghostly fingers. Anti-aircraft guns barked in the darkness, tracing fiery arcs into the night. And every dawn, exhausted crews counted the damage and prepared to do it all over again. The Battle of Britain reached its peak in September 1940. Despite overwhelming numbers, the Luftwaffe began to falter. They underestimated British radar, British fighters, and, most importantly, British resolve. Losses mounted, fuel grew scarce, and as autumn arrived, the weather turned against them. Clouds, fog, and storms grounding aircraft and frustrating pilots. By October, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. He had failed to subdue Britain. For the first time, the unstoppable Nazi war machine had been stopped, not by armies, but by courage in the clouds. Still, the bombing continued through the winter. It expanded beyond London, Coventry, Liverpool, Bristol, and Birmingham all suffered devastating raids. The Blitz became part of life, part of the rhythm of nights. Children were evacuated to the countryside for safety. Posters reminded everyone to keep calm, to dig for victory, and to careless talk costs lives. Even in darkness, humor endured. Shop windows bore signs reading, "More open than usual. Only the roof is gone." By the spring of 1941, the Blitz finally began to ease. The Luftwaffe turned its attention eastward, preparing for a new campaign, one far larger and far more dangerous. But the damage in Britain was immense. Over 40,000 civilians killed, hundreds of thousands of homes destroyed. And yet, the British spirit, battered, weary, but unbroken, survived. The nation had endured its trial by fire and stood ready for whatever came next. In quiet corners of London, new flowers began to grow among the rubble. A strange peace settled over the city, fragile, yet filled with resilience. The kind of peace that only those who've known chaos can truly understand. The war, however, was far from over. In the east, Hitler's gaze turned toward his next target, vast, cold, and filled with endless land, the Soviet Union. Chapter 5: Life During Wartime, Ordinary People in Extraordinary Times. War is often remembered for its battles, for generals, tanks, and grand strategy. But behind every line drawn on a map, there were lives, millions of ordinary souls trying to make sense of extraordinary times. This chapter drifts away from the front lines. Here, we step into the homes, shelters, and small corners of the world where people simply tried to live amid the thunder of war. The rhythm of wartime Britain. By 1941, Britain had settled into a strange new routine. Days began with ration lines, newspaper headlines, and the distant hum of aircraft. Nights were painted in shades of black, the blackout, when every window had to be covered to keep the city invisible to enemy bombers. Streetlights were dimmed, car headlights masked, and people stumbled through darkened streets like ghosts. Many carried small torches or matches, careful not to let the light show. And yet, there was a sort of eerie beauty to it. London, a city of silence and shadows, surviving each night by candlelight. Food was rationed too. Every family kept little booklets, ration cards, stamped for essentials like butter, sugar, tea, and meat. Creativity became a national art form. Cooks invented dishes from scraps, Woolton pie, mock goose, and cakes made with mashed potatoes instead of flour. Children learned to trade sweets like rare jewels. and the most treasured commodity of all was tea, hot, milky, and endlessly comforting. A small luxury that made life seem normal, if only for a moment. Evacuees and empty cities. When the bombing began, families faced impossible choices. Hundreds of thousands of children were sent from cities to the countryside, part of what was called Operation Pied Piper. Small suitcases, name tags around their necks, and gas masks slung over their shoulders. They boarded trains bound for safety. At the other end, volunteers waited. Farmers, villagers, even strangers opening their homes to these frightened young evacuees. For some children, it was the first time they'd seen open fields or farm animals. For others, it was heartbreaking, separated from parents, unsure when they'd return. Letters became lifelines, shaky handwriting from mothers and fathers, carried by postmen through rubble and rain. Sometimes they never arrived. Sometimes they did, and were read until the paper wore thin. Entertainment in dark times. Even in war, people needed to laugh, to sing, to dream. Cinema became a refuge, warm, dark, and full of hope. Films like Mrs. Miniver and In Which We Serve offered courage wrapped in stories. Music halls stayed open too. And on the radio, familiar voices brought comfort across the airwaves. Vera Lynn, the force's sweetheart, sang softly to millions. "We'll meet again. Don't know where. Don't know when." Her voice became a lullaby for an entire nation. Even soldiers far from home would close their eyes and imagine that song echoing across the sea. On the other side, life in Germany. Across the Channel, life in Germany was just as uncertain, though painted in different colors. Propaganda filled the airwaves, promising victory, glory, and destiny. Posters showed smiling soldiers, proud mothers, and perfect families. Images of a world that no longer quite existed. Behind closed doors, ordinary Germans faced shortages, fear, and the slow erosion of truth. The Gestapo, the secret police, listened for whispers of dissent. Even a careless joke could be dangerous. And yet, people still found ways to hold on to normal life. Mothers queued for food, children played among rubble, and neighbors quietly shared what little they had. For all sides in the war, survival meant more than food. It meant preserving fragments of humanity. Women at war. If the First World War had changed the role of women, the Second completely transformed it. With millions of men away fighting, women filled the factories, farms, and offices that kept nations alive. In Britain, they worked as mechanics, engineers, and land girls, tending fields and driving tractors once handled by men. In the United States, later in the war, they'd be known as Rosie the Riveter, sleeves rolled up, hair tied with scarves, proving that strength had no gender. It wasn't just about patriotism, it was about independence. Many women discovered new confidence and skills, though few knew whether life would ever return to what it once was. Occupied Europe, shadows and courage. In cities like Paris, Warsaw, and Amsterdam, life was lived under occupation, watched, restricted, and suffocating. Posters in foreign languages covered walls. Curfews emptied streets. And beneath the surface, a quiet defiance grew. The resistance began not with armies, but with whispers, coded messages, underground newspapers, secret meetings in candlelit basements. Ordinary citizens risked everything to smuggle information, hide fugitives, or sabotage enemy trains. Many never lived to see the results of their bravery, but their actions lit sparks that one day would help ignite liberation. The home front around the world. Beyond Europe, the war reached across oceans. In the United States, Factories roared to life even before the nation officially entered the conflict. In the Soviet Union, cities like Leningrad and Moscow prepared for unimaginable sieges. In Japan, people were told they were part of a divine destiny, an empire that would rule the Pacific. And in colonies across Africa, India, and Asia, millions were drawn into a war that wasn't truly theirs. Men enlisted, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. Supplies, resources, and hopes were all taken for the cause of distant powers. The world had never been so connected or so divided. Love, loss, and letters. Amid all of it, life found strange ways to continue. People fell in love, married in uniform, wrote vows by candlelight before heading off to uncertain fates. Letters became sacred things, folded and refolded, carried in breast pockets into battle. Some came back stained with dirt or seawater. Others never came back at all. And yet, for many, that thin piece of paper, a few lines of ink, was enough to keep hope alive. Dreams amid ruins. By 1942, the war had consumed nearly every part of life. But even then, people dreamed of peace, of gardens, of music. Children played with wooden toys carved from broken furniture. Artists sketched ruined streets with a kind of reverence, capturing beauty in destruction. The human heart, it seems, can adapt to anything, even chaos. And sometimes, in the smallest moments, a shared loaf of bread, a song, a sunrise, humanity quietly triumphed over war itself. The war machine roared on, but beneath it, life refused to die. In every city, every field, every shelter, people kept living. They kept waiting for the sound that would mean peace at last, the sound of silence. Chapter 6, Turning Tides, the Eastern Front and the Battle of Stalingrad. By the summer of 1941, Europe was already burning. But what came next would transform the war and the world itself. It began with a decision bold, reckless, and catastrophic. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in history. Over 3 million German soldiers, thousands of tanks, and the confidence of an empire that believed it could not fail. For months, the German armies swept across vast plains, crushing everything in their path. Villages vanished under the treads of tanks. Cities fell, Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, one after another, swallowed by fire and steel. And yet, as the German front stretched further east, something older and colder began to stir. Winter was coming, and Russia's winter, as history has often shown, is not an ally to invaders. The land of extremes. The Eastern Front was unlike anything seen before. It was a war fought across thousands of miles, from the forests of the Baltic to the oil fields of the Caucasus. There were no safe places, no quiet corners. In summer, the fields turned to mud, deep, sticky, swallowing tanks whole. In winter, the world froze solid. Rifles jammed, engines seized, and men froze to death in their trenches, surrounded by endless white. It was not just a war between armies, it was a war between worlds, between two ideologies. Nazism and communism, each claiming destiny, each ruthless in pursuit of it. The Siege of Leningrad. In September 1941, German forces surrounded the city of Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg. What followed was one of the longest and most tragic sieges in history. For 900 days, the city endured starvation, bombardment, and unthinkable cold. Bread rations fell to almost nothing, mere crumbs of sawdust and flour. People boiled wallpaper for the glue inside, ate pets, and in the darkest times, some turned to even worse. And yet, the city did not surrender. Symphony orchestras continued to play, even as shells fell outside. The Leningrad Symphony, performed in the middle of the siege, became a symbol of defiance, of beauty surviving amid horror. Each note, carried on frozen air, was a quiet act of rebellion. The march toward the Volga. By 1942, Hitler's attention turned south, toward the Caucasus oil fields and a city on the Volga River, Stalingrad. It was symbolic, named after his greatest rival, Joseph Stalin. To capture it would be to humiliate the Soviet Union. To defend it, Stalin ordered, would be a matter of life or death. The Germans advanced once more, their tanks cutting through endless wheat fields, their soldiers confident the war would soon end. They had no idea that they were marching into a trap of their own making. The Battle of Stalingrad. It began in August 1942 and would last for 6 brutal months. Stalingrad was not just fought for, it was devoured. Entire districts became battlegrounds. Factories, stairwells, and basements changed hands dozens of times a day. It was war stripped to its rawest form. Men fought hand-to-hand amid rubble, using knives, shovels, even bricks. Snipers haunted every corner. One shot could decide an entire street. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, trapped inside their shattered homes. The air was thick with smoke, the river choked with wreckage. And through it all, both sides refused to give in. The Germans called it Rationing, the Rat War, a fitting name, for it was fought in sewers, ruins, and shadows. Every building became a fortress, every wall a front line. The Soviet soldiers had orders, not one step back. Retreat meant execution. Deserters were shot, but so were the faint-hearted. To Western eyes, it seemed madness. But to the Soviets, this was survival, the defense of their homeland, their families, their pride. The turning of the tide. By November 1942, the German Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, was deep inside the ruins of Stalingrad. They had taken most of the city, but at an impossible cost. Winter had arrived again, and the Russians were not the same desperate soldiers of 1941. They had learned, adapted, and prepared. The Soviet counterattack, Operation Uranus, came suddenly, like a storm from nowhere. 2 massive Soviet armies struck from the north and south, encircling the Germans completely. It was one of the greatest reversals in military history. The trapped German soldiers dug in, waiting for rescue that would never come. Supplies were airdropped, but too few, too late. The men froze, starved, and fought in silence, knowing the end was near. By February 1943, after months of agony, the Sixth Army surrendered. Of the 300,000 who entered Stalingrad, fewer than 100,000 remained. And only a fraction of those would ever see Germany again. The human cost. Stalingrad was not just a victory or a defeat. It was a turning point, the moment the war's tide began to flow in reverse. But it came at a price beyond comprehension. Over 2 million soldiers and civilians were killed, wounded, or captured. The city itself was reduced to dust and ashes. Yet out of that ruin, something powerful was reborn. Soviet determination. From that moment, the German army would never again win a major battle in the East. The invincible Wehrmacht had been broken, not by machines or strategy, but by endurance. The Eastern Front awakens. After Stalingrad, the Soviet advance began. Slowly, painfully, the Red Army pushed westward. Each mile regained was paid for with blood. But the momentum had shifted. In Berlin, Hitler raged. In Moscow, Stalin smiled grimly. And in the rest of the world, people began to whisper a dangerous hope. Perhaps the war could be won. The snow over Stalingrad melted, revealing the bones of a battle that changed history. A city once destroyed became a symbol of resilience, proof that even in the darkest night, dawn could still come. Chapter 7: The World at War, the Pacific and Beyond. While Europe burned and froze, another story was unfolding across the other side of the world. In the vast blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean, it was a world of coral islands, ancient empires, and ambitions stretching across thousands of miles. Here, the war had its own rhythm, slower perhaps, but no less brutal. And it began, as many wars do, with a surprise that shattered the illusion of peace. Rising sun, growing shadows. In the early 20th century, Japan was a nation transformed. Once isolated and feudal, it had rapidly modernized, building railways, industries, and a powerful navy. But ambition ran deeper. Japan dreamed of an empire, one that would dominate Asia and free it from Western control, though in truth it sought its own form of mastery. By the late 1930s, Japan had already invaded China, leaving cities like Nanjing scarred by unimaginable atrocities. Its leaders spoke of destiny, of divine right, of the Emperor Hirohito as a living god. And behind these grand words stood men like General Tojo, who believed that Japan's strength must expand or die. The United States and Britain, alarmed by Japan's aggression, placed sanctions, cutting off vital oil and resources. But Japan did not back down. Instead, it chose to strike before its supplies ran dry. Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. It was early morning in Hawaii, the sun just beginning to rise over the calm waters of Pearl Harbor. Sailors stirred, breakfast was served, and the day promised peace. But high above, beyond the clouds, a Japanese fleet had launched hundreds of planes. At 7:48 a.m., the first bombs fell. Explosions tore through the still air. Ships burst into flames. The sky filled with black smoke, and the sea turned red with oil and fire. The USS Arizona was hit directly. Over 1,000 men died in an instant. The attack lasted barely 2 hours. But by the end, over 2,400 Americans were dead, and much of the Pacific Fleet lay in ruins. Across the radio waves, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's voice would soon declare it. A date which will live in infamy. The United States was now at war, and the sleeping giant had awoken. The Pacific War begins. The months that followed were a storm. Japan struck across the Pacific like lightning, seizing the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, Singapore, and islands across the Pacific Rim. Everywhere, Allied forces seemed powerless to stop them. The world map changed almost daily, red Japanese flags blooming across oceans and archipelagos. But Japan's expansion, vast as it was, stretched thin. Behind the victories lay overconfidence, and a deep underestimation of the resolve of those they had provoked. The fall of Singapore. Perhaps nowhere was this shock greater than in Singapore. The British Empire had long boasted that it was an impregnable fortress. Yet in February 1942, it fell after only a week of fighting. Over 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops were taken prisoner, the largest surrender in British history. The fall of Singapore sent ripples across the empire, signaling that the old world order was collapsing. In the words of one soldier, "We were lions led by donkeys, and now those lions were caged in foreign jungles." The road of suffering. As the Japanese advance continued, so too did the cruelty. Prisoners of war were forced into labor, the most infamous example being the Burma Railway, or the death railway. Tens of thousands died building it under unbearable heat, starvation, and disease. For civilians under occupation, in the Philippines, China, and Southeast Asia, life became a nightmare of fear and deprivation. Yet amid it all, resistance movements began to grow. Secret radios, underground cells, whispers of rebellion. The Pacific, once tranquil, had become a graveyard of empires. Midway, the tide turns. By mid-1942, Japan's empire had reached its height. But at a tiny atoll called Midway, the tide began to change. American cryptographers had cracked parts of Japan's naval code. They knew the attack was coming. When the Japanese fleet approached, the U.S. Navy was ready. In just a few days of fierce combat, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk, the same ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor. It was a staggering loss, one Japan could never truly recover from. Midway didn't just stop Japan's advance. It shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. For the first time, the seemingly unstoppable empire had faltered. Island hopping and relentless waves. After Midway, the Allied strategy changed. Rather than confront Japan everywhere, the U.S. began a campaign of island hopping. The plan was simple but brutal. Capture one island at a time, building airbases to strike the next. Each island was a fortress. The battles of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan were fought inch by inch, beach by beach. Tropical beauty hid unimaginable carnage. Soldiers fighting not just the enemy, but the heat, disease, and exhaustion. Yet, with each hard-won victory, the Allies moved closer to Japan itself. The home front in the Pacific. Far from the front lines, the war changed life in the United States too. Factories produced planes, ships, and weapons at unprecedented speed. Women joined the workforce in record numbers. Riveters, welders, machinists, all part of a new industrial army. Rationing, scrap drives, victory gardens, the war effort became a shared national mission. Even Hollywood joined in, producing films that stirred patriotism and morale. But not all was noble. In a moment now remembered with shame, the U.S. government interned Japanese Americans, fearing espionage. Over 100,000 people, most of them citizens, were forced from their homes and imprisoned behind barbed wire. War, it seemed, tested not only nations' strength but their conscience. The wider world. Beyond the Pacific, the war rippled into every corner of the globe. In North Africa, British and American forces fought under the desert sun against Rommel's Afrika Korps. In the Atlantic, Allied convoys braved the wolf packs of German U-boats. And in the skies over Europe, waves of bombers roared toward German cities. World War II had become truly global, a web of fire and steel spanning continents. A world forever changed. By late 1943, the tide had turned on all fronts. Germany was retreating in the east. Japan was bleeding across the Pacific. And the Allies, united and determined, were preparing for the next great push, the invasion of Europe itself. The world had endured years of darkness. But now, faintly, at the horizon, the first fragile light of victory began to glow. Chapter 8. The Invasion of Europe, D-Day and Beyond. By early 1944, the world had changed. The Axis powers, once vast and unstoppable, were now fighting to hold back the tide. Germany was losing ground in the east. Japan was retreating in the Pacific. And in the west, a long-awaited promise hung in the air. The liberation of Europe. The long preparation. The invasion was not a simple plan, nor a swift one. It took years of preparation, training, and deception. Millions of tons of supplies were gathered: tanks, trucks, ships, parachutes, and rations. An army was built in silence across southern England. They called it Operation Overlord. The Allies knew the risks. Across the English Channel, Hitler's forces had spent years fortifying the coastline: concrete bunkers, barbed wire, and gun nests known as the Atlantic Wall. Every general knew that crossing the Channel would be one of the most dangerous undertakings in history. And yet, there was no other way. Europe could not be freed from the air. It had to be reclaimed, inch by inch, with boots in the sand. The deception game. Before the real invasion could begin, the Allies played a vast game of illusion. They called it Operation Fortitude. Fake radio chatter, inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, and entire phantom armies were created to fool the Germans. General George S. Patton, known for his fiery temper and colorful speeches, was even placed in charge of a fictitious army, one that threatened to invade at Pas-de-Calais. The Germans believed it completely. Their eyes were fixed in the wrong place. Meanwhile, in secret, the real invasion force prepared to land in Normandy. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The night before the invasion was filled with wind and waves. Over 150,000 Allied troops waited aboard ships, seasick and silent, staring into darkness. Some wrote letters home. Others prayed. A few just sat quietly, thinking of fields, families, and faces they might never see again. At dawn, the world erupted. From the air, thousands of paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines, their white canopies glowing faintly in the moonlight. From the sea, the largest armada in history approached the French coast. 5 beaches bore the names that would become legend: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The longest day. When the ramps of the landing craft fell, chaos followed. Machine gun fire tore through the morning mist. Men stumbled into icy water, weighted by packs, dragged down by waves and fear. At Omaha Beach, the bloodiest of all, the first waves were cut to pieces. Bodies and broken equipment littered the shore. But somehow, through smoke and sheer will, soldiers pressed forward. They crawled, climbed, and clawed their way past the obstacles. By midday, the beachhead was secured. By nightfall, tens of thousands of men had crossed the Channel, and the liberation of Europe had begun. France awakens. Over the following days, Allied forces poured into Normandy. The countryside, with its hedgerows and narrow lanes, became a deadly maze. German tanks and snipers hid in every shadow, and progress was slow. But the Allies had one great advantage: unity. American, British, Canadian, Free French, and Polish troops fought side by side. Above them, the skies were filled with Allied aircraft, the long-awaited air superiority that the Germans could no longer challenge. French civilians watched from their shattered towns as liberation rolled in, cautious, tearful, and overwhelmed. Many wept as Allied soldiers handed them bread, chocolate, and hope. Paris is free. By August 1944, the Allies had broken through the German lines and were advancing rapidly. The French resistance, long waiting in the shadows, rose up inside Paris. Fighting broke out across the city. Barricades built from furniture, trams, and cars. When the first Allied tanks entered on August 25th, crowds filled the streets, shouting, crying, waving flags. The Eiffel Tower stood intact. After 4 long years, Paris was free again. In those moments, the war seemed briefly almost human. The bells of Notre Dame rang not for sorrow, but for joy. The German counterattack. But Hitler was not finished. That winter, As snow fell across the forests of Belgium, the Germans launched a desperate counterattack, the Battle of the Bulge. It came suddenly on December 16, 1944, under cover of fog and surprise. American troops were surrounded, cut off, and outnumbered. At the town of Bastogne, when asked to surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied with one word: "Nuts." The fighting was fierce, the cold unbearable, but the line held. When the skies cleared, Allied planes returned, and the German offensive collapsed. It was their last gasp, the final illusion of strength from a crumbling empire. Closing in. By early 1945, the Allied armies were moving inexorably toward Germany itself. To the east, the Soviet Union advanced through Poland, sweeping toward Berlin. To the west, American and British forces crossed the Rhine River, the natural barrier that had once seemed impassable. Germany was collapsing. Its cities lay in ruins, its soldiers starving, its leader increasingly detached from reality. But before the end could come, the world would have to face something even darker, something beyond the battlefield. The liberation of Europe was at hand, but what the Allies would soon discover inside Germany's camps would redefine forever what humanity was capable of, and what it must never allow again. Chapter 9: Shadows and Liberation, the Holocaust and the End of the Reich. By the spring of 1945, the world was staggering toward an ending. The Axis powers were crumbling, their armies retreating, their cities in ruins. But as Allied soldiers advanced deeper into the heart of Germany, they began uncovering something that words could never truly hold. Behind the front lines, beyond the smoke and rubble, they found the camps. Whispers of horror. At first, the reports were almost unbelievable. Prisoners, skeletal, silent, wandering among barbed wire and ashes. Piles of shoes, stacks of glasses, mountains of hair. The world had heard rumors for years. Whispers of deportations, disappearances, and strange labor camps. But what the liberating armies discovered at Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and Auschwitz defied imagination. These were not labor camps. They were factories of death. The machinery of genocide. The Holocaust, the Shoah, as it is known in Hebrew, had been engineered with cold, bureaucratic precision. Under the rule of Adolf Hitler and his SS architects, millions of men, women, and children were systematically murdered. Jews, Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, LGBTQ+ individuals, and countless others, all targeted, stripped of identity, and sent to die. The methods were industrial. Trains that ran on schedule, gas chambers disguised as showers, furnaces that burned day and night. Over 6 million Jews perished. Entire families erased, entire towns emptied, their voices silenced into numbers tattooed on skin. Even those who survived carried scars that no lifetime could heal. Liberation. In April 1945, Allied soldiers entered Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. They were hardened men, veterans of years of war. And yet, even they wept at what they saw. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, upon visiting a camp, insisted that everything be photographed. He said, "Get it all on record now. Get the films, get the witnesses, because somewhere down the track of history, some bastard will get up and say that this never happened." And he was right. Those images remain, frozen in time, so that humanity might never forget. The survivors, gaunt, ghostly, looked upon their liberators with eyes that had seen too much. Some whispered words of thanks. Others simply stood, too weak to move. Freedom had come, but it came too late for millions. The fall of Berlin. While the camps were being uncovered, the war itself reached its final crescendo. In April 1945, Soviet forces encircled Berlin. The once mighty German capital had become a wasteland of ruins and desperation. In the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler ranted, raved, and refused to face reality. His empire was gone, his armies destroyed. And so, on April 30th, 1945, he took his own life. The symbol of tyranny vanished into the earth, the final act of a man who had brought the world to ruin. Within days, Germany surrendered. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, or V-Day, was declared. Church bells rang across cities, fireworks lit the sky, and people danced in the streets. But amid the joy, there was a deep, aching silence too. A mourning for all who never came home. The world reacts. As the news of the Holocaust spread, the world grappled with disbelief and shame. How could such horror happen in modern civilization? How had so many turned away, looked aside, obeyed orders? In the months that followed, the Nuremberg trials began, a monumental attempt to bring the architects of genocide to justice. For the first time in history, crimes against humanity became a legal phrase. Men in fine suits, officers, administrators, propagandists, were forced to confront the consequences of their obedience. The excuse, "I was only following orders," would never again be enough. The war in the Pacific continues. Even as Europe celebrated peace, the war was still raging across the Pacific. Japan refused to surrender. The fighting on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa was brutal beyond imagination. Kamikaze pilots, caves turned into fortresses, soldiers fighting to the last breath. President Harry S. Truman, who had taken office after Roosevelt's death, faced an impossible choice: invade Japan at the cost of perhaps millions of lives, or use a weapon so terrible that it might end the war instantly. That weapon was the atomic bomb. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m., the city of Hiroshima was bathed in a sudden, blinding light. A single bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, exploded above the city. In a moment, everything was gone. Buildings, streets, tens of thousands of lives. A mushroom cloud rose into the sky, silent and monstrous. 3 days later, a second bomb, Fat Man, fell on Nagasaki. The devastation was complete. Over 200,000 people, mostly civilians, perished. Japan surrendered shortly after. The war, the deadliest in human history, was finally over. The silence after the storm. In the months that followed, the world tried to comprehend what it had lived through. Cities had vanished. Families had been scattered. Empires had fallen. And yet, out of the ruins, hope began to stir. Nations gathered to create the United Nations, vowing to preserve peace. War crimes were prosecuted, refugees were resettled, and reconstruction began. Brick by brick, life by life. In the ashes of Berlin, Warsaw, and Tokyo, flowers would one day grow again. Children would laugh again. The world, wounded but alive, would rebuild. Reflections. World War II was not just a conflict of nations. It was a reckoning for humanity itself. It showed the heights of courage and the depths of cruelty, the power of unity and the danger of hate. Over 70 million people lost their lives. Soldiers, civilians, the innocent and the guilty alike. Each one a universe of dreams, now gone. But their memory endures, in books, in stories, in the quiet lessons of history. Because even in its darkest hours, humanity found light, in the bravery of resistance fighters, in the kindness of nurses, in the stubborn will to survive. And perhaps that is what history truly is, not a record of battles and empires, but a reminder of what we must protect: compassion, freedom, and life itself, a moment of rest. So, as this long war fades into memory, let us rest, not in sorrow, but in reflection. The guns have fallen silent, the skies are calm, and somewhere, across the sleeping world, peace has returned at last. Chapter 10: Aftermath and a New World, the Cold Dawn of the Atomic Age. The war had ended, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was a breath, heavy and uncertain. Across the continents, smoke still curled from shattered cities. Families searched the ruins for names, faces, any trace of what had been lost. The old world, the one of empires, colonies, and kings, was gone. And in its place, something entirely new was beginning to take shape. This was the dawn of the modern world, a time of hope, rebuilding, and a new, uneasy kind of fear, picking up the pieces. When the guns finally stopped, much of the planet was in ruins. Europe, once the center of civilization, lay broken. Cities like Berlin, Warsaw, and Dresden were heaps of brick and memory. Rail lines twisted like ribbons of steel. Millions were homeless, refugees wandering the roads, looking for countries that no longer existed. Yet, amid the devastation, people began to rebuild. In Britain, the sound of hammers replaced the sound of air raid sirens. In France, painters and poets returned to cafes to rediscover beauty. In Germany, survivors faced the ruins of both their homes and their conscience. And in the ashes of Japan, where even the stones seemed to glow from the bomb's heat, a generation vowed, never again. The United Nations and a hope for peace. In 1945, delegates from 50 nations gathered in San Francisco to form a new organization, one that might prevent the horrors of another world war. It would be called the United Nations. Its mission was both simple and impossible: to preserve peace, protect human rights, and encourage cooperation among nations. In its early sessions, speeches were filled with idealism and weariness in equal measure. The world had seen what division could do, and now it dreamed, however faintly, of unity. The Nuremberg trials, justice in the ruins. Back in Germany, a courtroom in the city of Nuremberg became the stage for something the world had never seen before. For the first time in human history, leaders of a defeated nation were put on trial for their crimes against humanity. The men who once gave orders to armies now sat behind glass, silent, as evidence of their atrocities was laid bare. Films from the concentration camps were shown in court. Documents signed in elegant handwriting revealed plans for genocide. One by one, the architects of the Nazi regime were judged, not as soldiers in a war, but as men who had chosen cruelty over conscience. The Nuremberg trials established a principle that still echoes today: that no leader, no matter how powerful, is above the law of humanity. A divided world. But as the old war ended, a new one quietly began. The uneasy alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union, once united against Hitler, began to fracture. Each had emerged from the war as a superpower, one capitalist, one communist. Their visions for the world could not have been more different. The United States spoke of freedom and democracy. The Soviet Union spoke of equality and revolution. And between them stretched an invisible line, a divide of ideology, mistrust, and fear. It became known as the Iron Curtain. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, described it in 1946. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, An iron curtain has descended across the continent. The Cold War had begun, not with bullets or bombs, but with suspicion, spies, and nuclear shadows. The age of the atom. The atomic bomb had ended one war, but it had also begun an entirely new era. In the deserts of New Mexico, the first atomic test had lit up the night sky with terrifying beauty. The scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer, who helped create it, remembered a line from ancient scripture: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world knew that humanity had crossed a threshold. Science had given man godlike power, the power to end civilization with a single weapon. And so nations raced to build their own. The United States tested hydrogen bombs. The Soviet Union soon followed. The skies above were peaceful, but beneath the surface, the world trembled. The Marshall Plan and rebirth. Despite the fear, there was also renewal. In 1948, the Marshall Plan was launched, a vast American effort to rebuild Europe's shattered economies. Factories reopened, schools were rebuilt, and railways hummed again. It wasn't just money. It was a statement that cooperation and recovery could be the antidote to despair. And it worked. Within a decade, Western Europe was thriving again, a symbol of what peace could achieve when paired with purpose. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union rebuilt its own sphere, Eastern Europe, locked behind the Iron Curtain, bound by ideology rather than alliance. Two worlds, one planet, and a cold tension that would define the next half-century. Japan's transformation. Across the Pacific, Japan, too, began a remarkable transformation. Its cities were rebuilt from the ground up. Under American occupation, the country adopted a new constitution, one that renounced war forever. From ashes rose industry, innovation, and an extraordinary cultural rebirth. Within decades, Japan would become one of the world's leading economies, a testament to resilience, peace, and reinvention. A new age of humanity. As the 1940s turned into the 1950s, the world stood on unfamiliar ground. Televisions flickered to life in homes across America and Europe. Jet planes connected continents. And in the background, scientists began dreaming of reaching the stars. But beneath all the progress, the memories of war remained, in photographs, in ruins, in the eyes of those who had lived through it. The 20th century had revealed both the best and worst of mankind. The question now was, which side of that nature would guide the future? The lessons that remain. When we look back at World War II, it's tempting to see it as distant history, black and white footage, old songs, famous speeches. But it wasn't that long ago. It lived in the memories of parents, grandparents, neighbors, people who built the world we now inherit. And so, dear listener, the story of the Second World War drifts quietly to rest. The tanks are silent now. The soldiers sleep beneath the soil of the world they saved. The cities hum once more with laughter and life. If history teaches us anything, it's that even in the darkest nights, dawn will come, slowly, softly, inevitably. And as you close your eyes tonight, may you remember not the roar of war, but the peace that followed it. Because every sunrise, every breath of calm, is a small victory of its own. If you enjoyed this journey through World War II, you can help our channel grow by liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts or favorite part of the story, and subscribing to the Deep Sleep Library so we can continue exploring lost worlds and ancient mysteries together. Even a small click lets this story, and many more like it, reach others who love to drift into history as you do tonight.